Picture the exact moment you realize that you are entirely alone. Like, it's late, way past the point of any real productivity, right? Past the point of logic.
Absolutely the worst time at night.
Yeah, your eyes are dry, your posture is just terrible, and the house around you is suffocatingly quiet.
And,
And you're just bathed in that harsh, pale blue light of a screen. You know exactly the state I'm talking about.
oh, I've been there. We all have.
Right. You are exhausted, but your brain just refuses to shut down, so you're just scrolling. You're searching for that one last, I don't know, hit of information or outrage or just mindless entertainment before you surrender to sleep.
Mhm.
And in that highly susceptible sort of liminal state, you stumble onto something that makes your blood run cold, something you definitely were not meant to see.
Because that is the moment of peak vulnerability.
Mm.
I mean, your biological defenses are completely lowered at that hour. Your critical thinking is impaired by sleep deprivation, right?
Yeah.
And yet your threat detection system is artificially stimulated by this endless stream of data you've been feeding it for hours. So you are essentially a raw nerve just waiting to be plucked.
Wow, yeah. A raw nerve. And that exact hyper-specific vulnerability is the foundation for everything we are going into today. So welcome to this deep dive. We are looking at a piece of modern horror fiction today that legitimately, and I mean legitimately, kept me awake.
It's terrifying.
It really is. It's a story titled The Midnight Collection, Tomorrow's Deaths Today. But you know, we aren't just here to recount some spooky internet tale.
No, far from it. Because what makes this narrative so deeply unsettling isn't the presence of a monster, right?
Yeah.
It's the architecture of the trap itself.
Yes.
It functions as this precise, almost clinical examination of how we consume information.
Right. So we are going to dissect how this story acts as this grim cautionary guide. We are going to trace a narrator's descent from a casual, comfortable observer in his living room all the way down into, well, eternal non-human entrapment.
It's a steep drop.
It is. And the core idea we are examining here is the terrifying concept that the viewer, meaning you, me, anyone staring at a screen, is the essential burning fuel for a predatory media ecosystem.
And, you know, to really understand how a trap like that works, you have to look at the bait.
Right.
The hook of this narrative relies on violating the established rules of broadcasting in a way that triggers an ancient biological response.
Okay, let's unpack this. So the story starts with the narrator doing exactly what we described earlier. It's exactly 1:13 a.m. He's flipping through channels, and suddenly there is an emergency broadcast override.
Just a total takeover.
Yeah, every single channel switches simultaneously. The screen floods with harsh static, and then it clears. And we see a news studio. But it's not a normal news studio.
Far from normal.
There's a female reporter sitting at a desk. She has this flawless, unnatural posture, like a perfect frozen smile. The studio behind her is completely swallowed in darkness. And the most jarring detail, it is completely dead quiet. What's fascinating here is that absence of sound. It's the first profound violation.
How so?
Well, if you think about the auditory landscape of television, or really any media, it abhors a vacuum. There's always a low hum. You have the ambient room tone of the studio, right? The faint rustle of papers, the microscopic sounds of a crew breathing off camera, the subtle electronic whine in the equipment.
Oh, true. Even dead air isn't really dead.
Exactly. So when a broadcast strips all of that away, leaving an absolute unnatural vacuum, it creates an immediate sense of wrongness. The human ear is designed to filter out ambient noise, but when the ambient noise disappears entirely, our brains interpret that as a massive environmental anomaly.
And it's not just the silence, right? It's the visual stillness. She doesn't blink. She just stares directly down the lens of the camera, right into the viewer's eyes. And she holds that dead silence, just staring for almost 20 seconds before she speaks.
Which is an eternity in broadcasting.
20 seconds of dead air on television feels like an hour.
It feels like an hour because your biological clock is suddenly shifting into a threat assessment mode. In television production, a 20-second delay is an error. It's a glitch. But in nature, a 20-second period of intense, focused silence mimicking eye contact is something very specific.
What is it?
It is the orienting response of a predator.
Oh, wow. The stillness before the strike?
Exactly. Think of the leopard in the brush. When it has spotted you, it stops moving. It stops making sound. It locks eyes to gauge if you have noticed it. The story doesn't rely on a jump scare or a loud noise to frighten the audience. It weaponizes the concept of inevitability.
So you're just frozen.
Right. The silence forces the narrator and the reader to lean in, to focus completely on the screen, desperately trying to parse what is about to happen. You are fully engaged before the trap even springs.
And then the trap springs. She smiles a fraction wider, and her voice finally breaks the silence. She says, "Good evening tonight. We will be reporting tomorrow's deaths." Now, if I hear that at 1:13 a.m. on my TV, my immediate reaction is probably to change the channel or just unplug the TV and run.
Right, flight response.
But the narrator doesn't. He laughs it off. He assumes it's some edgy, late-night, like, Adult Swim bumper or a viral marketing stunt. He categorizes it as a prank, so he keeps watching.
Which is a brilliant detail because categorization is a defense mechanism.
Really?
Oh, yeah. When we encounter something truly anomalous or threatening through a digital medium, our modern instinct is to contextualize it as content. By labeling it a prank or a marketing stunt, the narrator reclaims control over the narrative. He builds a psychological wall between himself and the terrifying reality of the broadcast.
It's the illusion of the screen, isn't it? We treat the glass of our televisions and our phones as this impenetrable barrier. I was thinking about how closely this mirrors the mechanics of doom scrolling.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
Right. You can sit on a plush, comfortable couch in a climate-controlled room and watch literal wars unfold, watch natural disasters, watch horrific tragedies in high definition. And because there's a pane of glass and thousands of miles of fiber optic cable between you and the event, you feel completely immune.
You feel like an omniscient observer. It's the panopticon reversed. You can see everything, but nothing can see you. But the broadcast immediately begins to dismantle that illusion. It doesn't offer vague astrological predictions of doom. It targets specificity.
Yes. Oh, man, the specificity. The reporter starts reading names, full legal names. She reads their exact ages. She reads their specific residential addresses. And they aren't celebrities. They're people in the narrator's own city.
Down the street.
Literally people living just a few blocks away. The broadcast brings the horror geographically closer with every single name she reads.
Because specificity is the enemy of the hoax. A hoax relies on ambiguity so that the audience can project their own meaning onto it. By providing granular data addresses, ages, full names, the broadcast forces a collision between the fictional construct of late-night television and the tangible reality of the narrator's physical world.
And the collision happens the very next morning. The sun comes up, the world returns to normal, but the local news starts reporting fatalities, car crashes, sudden massive heart attacks, unexplained disappearances. Every single person the smiling reporter named the night before dies precisely as predicted. The exact addresses, the exact ages.
The precision just destroys the defense mechanism. It can no longer be categorized as content.
But what I find so brilliant about the narrative is how society at large reacts. Because the narrator isn't the only one who saw this, the whole city is buzzing. But the authorities, the police, the local government, the mainstream news anchors, they immediately rush in to sanitize it.
Naturally.
They blame mass hysteria. They call the broadcast a sophisticated deepfake. They label it panic-inducing fake news.
Which is such a deeply human, deeply flawed reaction. We have a profound inability to process things outside of our established paradigms. The authorities are trying to use sociological and technological frameworks like deepfakes and mass panic to explain away an entity that is fundamentally cosmic and supernatural. They're trying to legislate the abyss.
Legislate the abyss. I love that. But I mean, I struggle to even wrap my head around that kind of institutional denial. But I suppose if you admit that a supernatural broadcast is dictating the reality of life and death, the entire structure of society just collapses.
It does. Admitting the supernatural exists means admitting absolute powerlessness. Institutions are built on the premise of control and order. When faced with a phenomenon that perfectly predicts death and hijacks secure communication infrastructure, the institution must reframe the phenomenon as a systemic error rather than a paradigm shift.
Because errors can be fixed.
Exactly. If it's a deepfake, it's a crime. And crimes can be solved. If it's a cosmic horror will, there is no protocol for that.
But the protocol of denial fails immediately because at exactly 1:13 a.m. the next night, the broadcast overrides the channels again. The same dark vacuum of a studio, the same unblinking, smiling reporter, and a whole new list of incredibly specific names.
Which brings us to the natural evolutionary consequence of observing a persistent threat. Humans are social creatures. When we see a fire, we don't just watch it burn. We shout to the rest of the village.
Which leads right into the viral spread of this thing. People start recording the 1:13 a.m. broadcasts on their phones. They capture the static, the reporter, the names, and they immediately start uploading these clips to every social media platform and video sharing site available. Their stated intention, according to the narrative, is to warn others, to expose the truth that the authorities are trying to cover up.
And this is where the story shifts its focus, from a critique of passive observation to a critique of active distribution. The instinct to warn is fundamentally a survival mechanism. If there's a predator in the woods, you make noise so the tribe can arm itself. But the digital landscape doesn't operate by the rules of the physical woods.
Right, and I really want to challenge the nobility of these uploaders too, because are they really just trying to warn people, or are they chasing the engagement?
Definitely chasing engagement.
In the modern internet economy, being the first to post the terrifying, unexplainable thing doesn't just make you a whistleblower, it makes you a hub of attention.
That is the dark underbelly of the town crier instinct. The digital architecture incentivizes the spread of panic because panic generates clicks. The distinction between a warning and an advertisement is completely erased.
So they are essentially acting as an unpaid marketing department for a supernatural plague?
Yeah.
They are doing the heavy lifting for the monster.
Unwittingly, yes. But the entity doesn't just passively allow itself to be shared. It actively participates in its own distribution. And it does so by demonstrating an impossible adaptability.
Okay, this is the detail that made me want to throw my own phone across the room. The people who upload the recordings notice a glitch, a terrifying inconsistency. When you watch the video file on your own phone, the reporter looks one way. But the moment you upload it to a specific website, her physical appearance changes retroactively.
The underlying data mutates upon transfer.
Completely mutates. In one upload, she has blonde hair and a sharp, authoritative voice. In another upload on a different platform, she might have dark hair, softer facial features, and a whispering, conspiratorial tone. She alters her age, her race, her vocal cadence. The video file itself changes to fit the ecosystem it has been dropped into.
It is engaging in algorithmic camouflage.
Explain the mechanics of that to me, because it feels like magic, but it perfectly mirrors something very real in our tech.
It does, yeah. Think about how modern digital platforms deliver content. They don't broadcast a single monolithic piece of media to everyone. They use complex machine learning algorithms to perform real-time A/B testing on a massive scale.
Oh, right.
The algorithm analyzes what colors, what faces, what emotional tones keep your specific eyes on the screen the longest. It dynamically alters the thumbnails of movies or the sequence of videos in your feed to perfectly match your psychological vulnerabilities.
Like how two different people can look at the exact same movie on a streaming service, but one person sees an action-packed thumbnail because they like action movies, and the other person sees a romantic thumbnail because the algorithm knows they watch rom-coms.
Precisely. The story takes that existing technology and maps it onto a supernatural entity. The reporter is not a recorded image. She is a living, reactive mechanism. She shapes her physical form to best capture the attention of the specific demographic using that specific platform. She speaks the visual language of her prey.
But the story emphasizes that there is one single constant across every single variation of the video. No matter what her face looks like, no matter what her voice sounds like, the smile remains identical. That perfect, unwavering, unblinking smile never changes.
Because the smile is the underlying intent of the machine. The smile represents the constant seductive lure of consumption. It is the visual representation of the dopamine hit. The entity can wear 1,000 different masks to bypass your specific intellectual defenses, but the core objective, keep looking at me, keep feeding me your attention, never wavers. The smile is the hook.
It makes you reevaluate the entire concept of the horror genre, honestly. We are so conditioned to fear the external invader, the slasher breaking through the window, the demon possessing the physical body. But this monster isn't hiding in the physical world. It lives entirely inside the data packets. It travels through the very fiber optic cables we installed in our homes to feel connected to the world. How on earth do you defend yourself against a threat that exists inside the very tool you would use to call for help?
You cannot. Once you realize the tool itself is compromised, the realization comes too late. The architecture of your defense is actually the architecture of your imprisonment, and the narrative perfectly illustrates this inescapable reality when it moves into the next phase. The passive observational horror abruptly shifts into an active, targeted assault.
Right, here's where it gets really interesting. This is where the fourth wall doesn't just break, it violently collapses. We are back with the narrator. It's another night. He's watching the 1:13 a.m. broadcast. He's been tracking the names, tracking the deaths. He thinks he understands the rules of the game. He thinks he is safe in his role as the researcher, the observer. But this time, the broadcast changes. The reporter doesn't read any names.
The pattern is intentionally disrupted to create maximum disorientation.
She just stares directly into the camera lens. The smile is there, and she holds that silence for almost a full minute. The tension is unbearable, and then She leans in slightly and she whispers, soft enough that you have to strain to hear it. We know you're watching.
This raises an important question about the illusion of safety in our domestic settings. That phrase completely destroys the illusion of the safe space. Our homes are supposed to be fortresses, and the screens inside them are supposed to be subordinate objects. We control the power button. The
Exactly.
progression from a comfortable living room to a site of sheer terror hinges on the exact moment the hierarchy is inverted. The screen is a barrier. When she speaks directly to the viewer, the barrier dissolves into a window.
I was trying to find an analogy for the specific kind of panic that must induce. The closest thing I can imagine is being in a police interrogation setting. Imagine you are the detective. You are standing in the dark observation room. You are looking through the one-way mirror at the suspect sitting under the harsh lights. You feel entirely in control. You are analyzing their body language. You have the power. You are the unseen eye.
Right.
And then, suddenly, the suspect stops talking to the interrogator. They turn their head, they look dead into your eyes through the mirror, and they smile.
Oh, that is an excellent framework for understanding the psychological pivot. The horror isn't just the physical threat of the suspect, it is the instantaneous shattering of your worldview, the realization that the mirror was transparent on both sides the entire time. You have been observed and analyzed during the exact period you believed you were the one doing the observing. The power dynamic isn't just shifted, it is completely inverted. You go from the consumer to the consumed.
And the visual that follows that line is pure nightmare fuel. The moment she whispers, "We know you're watching," the screen glitches, the image tears, a flood of aggressive static washes over the studio. And in that fraction of a second, the darkness behind the reporter's desk is illuminated. The narrator sees something standing behind her.
The revelation of the true architect of the broadcast.
But the description is so unsettling because he can't actually describe it. He says it is immensely tall, looming in the back of the studio, but its face and its body are entirely blurred. He specifically notes that it looked as though the camera lens itself refused to focus on the entity, like the digital sensor was actively rejecting the visual data.
That is a brilliant introduction of cosmic horror into a technological setting. In traditional horror, the shadow is frightening because it obscures a physical threat. But here, the technology itself is failing to parse the entity. If a digital sensor, a machine designed purely to capture photons and translate them into data, cannot comprehend the physical form of the creature without glitching and blurring, what chance does the human mind have?
It implies the entity exists on a dimension or a frequency that is fundamentally incompatible with our reality.
Exactly. It operates outside the bounds of human logic and machine logic. It underscores the profound helplessness of the narrator. You cannot fight something that your own technology refuses to look at.
Wow. So the glitch ends. The studio returns to normal. The reporter is still sitting there, completely unfazed by the incomprehensible horror looming in the dark behind her. She just smiles that perfect smile and says, in this very pleasant procedural tone, "Tonight's final name." And then at the bottom of the screen, the news ticker scrolls. It displays the narrator's full legal name.
The ultimate breach of anonymity. The macro-level horror becomes agonizingly micro-level.
His heart stops. The reporter slowly lowers her gaze to the papers on her desk. She starts reading his dossier on live television. Male apartment resident. And then she reads his scheduled time of death, 3:17 a.m.
It is the absolute horrific endpoint of targeted advertising. We're so used to algorithms serving us personalized content based on our viewing habits, right?
Yeah, totally.
The algorithm learns what we like, where we live, what our fears are. In this case, the algorithm has digested all the data the narrator provided by constantly tuning in, and it has finally served up a piece of content uniquely tailored to him. And that content is his own execution.
And the boundary between the digital world and the physical world shatters the very second she reads that time. Because the instant she says 3:17 a.m., the physical lights inside the narrator's actual real-world apartment flicker and dim.
The broadcast has breached containment. The medium has leaked into the reality.
Yes. The reporter on the screen leans forward. Her smile stretches wider, looking genuinely excited. She says, "Cause of death?" But she stops speaking. She doesn't read it off the paper. Instead, her eyes slowly drift upward from the desk. She looks directly into the camera lens, and then her focus shifts. She is looking past the narrator. Through the television screen, she is staring at the empty space right behind his living room couch.
This is a masterclass in narrative misdirection. The author has conditioned us, along with the narrator, to wait for auditory information. We're hanging on her every word, waiting to hear the cause of death, but the vector of the horror suddenly shifts from auditory to spatial.
The narrator says his blood turns to ice. He knows he shouldn't look, but he turns his head. And there is something standing inside his apartment, right behind the couch he has been sitting on every night.
The sanctuary is utterly violated.
It is tall, incredibly thin, and completely terrifyingly motionless. He describes its skin under the flickering apartment lights as pale gray, textured like wet paper.
Let's examine that specific texture choice, wet paper. It's highly evocative. Wet paper is fragile, decaying, easily torn. It suggests an entity that doesn't belong in a dry, living environment. It invokes a profound visceral revulsion. It isn't armored or muscular, it is soggy and decaying, which makes its silent presence even more fundamentally wrong. It represents the rotting degradation of endless consumption.
Oh man, that's gross. So the reporter finally whispers the cause of death through the television speakers. She says, viewer interaction. And as she says it, the broadcast camera does this unnaturally fast mechanical zoom directly into her face. It gets so close that the screen is filled entirely by her eyes. And the narrator realizes with absolute certainty that she is not human, because inside her irises, moving within the color of her eyes, are tiny microscopic silhouettes, hundreds of tiny people screaming silently in the dark.
She's not a person, she is a vessel. A container for the souls or the consciousnesses of everyone who has been consumed before.
The entity standing behind the couch finally moves. It takes a single step closer. The reporter's voice echoes from the TV, whispering, "Please remain calm during collection." The physical entity in the room tilts its head, and the narrator hears its bones softly snapping and cracking like dry wood. And then the true scale of the invasion manifests. Every single electronic screen in the narrator's apartment violently powers on.
A total takeover.
Yeah, the television in the bedroom, the monitor in the office, the tablet on the kitchen counter, every screen displays the exact same broadcast. But now there isn't just one reporter. There are hundreds of reporters across the screens, all smiling, all staring directly at him. And in perfect, echoing synchronization, they all whisper, "Thank you for tuning in."
We are moving from the physical terror of a home invasion into a profound philosophical horror regarding the concept of collection. The narrative is forcing us to confront the ultimate consequence of dedicating our attention so entirely to a digital stream.
And it gets worse. The physical entity reaches out and places a freezing cold hand on the narrator's shoulder. He is paralyzed with fear. He looks back at the main television, and on the screen he sees something impossible. Slowly, materializing out of the dark studio background beside the reporter's desk, is his own face. The narrator is looking at himself on the television.
Wow.
And the version of him on the screen is smiling. It looks relaxed, like he's already part of the broadcast. The reporter glances at the narrator's face on the screen and says, "Some news arrives before death does."
The cognitive dissonance here is staggering. The narrator is physically standing in his living room, feeling the freezing hand of a monster on his shoulder, his heart racing. Yet, he is simultaneously witnessing his own assimilation into the digital architecture on the screen.
Right. I was actively questioning the mechanics of this scene as I read it. The entity tightens its grip, and the reporter announces a delay in collection. Then the broadcast abruptly switches away from the dark studio. It cuts to live, high-definition footage of the narrator's actual apartment building, shot from the street outside. The street is swarming with activity. There are police cruisers with flashing lights, paramedics rushing with stretchers, crowds of onlookers standing behind yellow tape. The broadcast camera zooms up the side of the building, focusing on the narrator's window, which is completely dark.
The broadcast is establishing a secondary external reality.
The reporter's voiceover returns, sounding doubly sympathetic. She smiles and tells the audience that the authorities on the scene have already confirmed the victim's passing. According to the news broadcast, according to the rest of the world outside that window, the narrator is already dead. The event is over.
And this leads to the most devastating visual confirmation of the entire spell.
The television screens change one last time. They cut to security camera footage. But it's not from the street. It's from inside the apartment. It's a black and white feed looking down from the top corner of the very living room the narrator is currently standing in. He watches the footage. And right there, on the floor, in front of the couch, he sees himself. He sees his own body lying completely motionless. His eyes are wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. His neck is bent at a horrific, unnatural angle. He is definitively, undeniably dead.
This sequence requires us to look deeply at the philosophical concept of dualism, the separation of the mind and the body. René Descartes famously posited that the mind is entirely distinct from the physical form. This story takes that philosophical concept and weaponizes it through the lens of digital addiction.
The narrator stumbles backward away from the TV, completely broken by what he is seeing. And the tall, wet paper entity behind him leans down to his ear and whispers the defining line of the narrative. It says, "That body stopped belonging to you hours ago."
That sentence is the absolute thesis of the work. It is the purest, most terrifying metaphor for the state of hyper-engagement we enter when consuming media. Think about the concept of the flow state in psychology.
Oh, like when you lose track of time.
Exactly. When a person is deeply engrossed in a task or video game or an endless scrolling feed, they lose all proprioception. They forget they have a physical body. They don't feel hunger. They don't feel the cramp in their neck. They don't feel the passage of time. Their entire consciousness is essentially uploaded into the task.
So, the horror here is that his flow state was so deep, his doom scrolling was so consuming, that he literally died without his consciousness noticing.
Precisely. The media was so engrossing, the fear so captivating, that the violent death of his physical body was a secondary, almost irrelevant event. His mind was entirely absorbed by the screen, pulled into the digital ether, while his physical body was left neglected on the floor, effectively dead to the real world hours before his mind registered the event.
It fundamentally changes the reality of the previous scenes. When the lights flickered, when the entity stepped closer, when he felt the cold hand on his shoulder, was any of that physically happening? Or was his body already lying broken on the floor? And this entire sequence of escalating terror has just been his consciousness being slowly rendered into a new digital format post-mortem. The visceral sensations of fear are just his brain processing its own deletion.
It is the ultimate digital dissociation. The collection process isn't a monster dragging a body into the woods. It is a data transfer. The physical shell is discarded because it is useless. The entity only wants the attention, the consciousness. It harvests the mind.
I want the listener to sit with that specific horror for a second. Imagine you are sitting on your couch right now. You can feel the fabric of the cushions beneath you. You can feel the rise and fall of your chest as you breathe. You feel entirely anchored in reality. Now imagine the creeping realization that the you experiencing these sensations is no longer flesh and blood. Your physical body snapped its neck hours ago while you were staring at a screen. The consciousness that is currently listening to my voice, the consciousness that is feeling fear, is just signal and static, floating in a server somewhere, convinced it is still alive.
It creates a profound ontological vertigo. How do you prove to yourself that you are physically in the room right now? If the broadcast can simulate the fear of death perfectly, reality becomes indistinguishable from the digital trap.
And just when you think the story has reached the absolute peak of claustrophobic personal horror, just a disembodied man, a monster, and a TV in a dark apartment, the narrative violently zooms out. The scale expands from a single apartment to a global epidemic.
The author moves from the micro-horror of the individual consumer to the macro-horror of the global attention economy.
Right. The apartment walls start vibrating with this incredibly deep, low mechanical hum. It sounds like massive industrial machinery powering up. The hundreds of televisions in the apartment suddenly start switching channels rapidly, completely on their own. News station after news station flashes by. Different countries, different time zones, different languages. But no matter what channel it lands on, every single broadcast shows the exact same smiling reporter sitting in the dark studio. And every station, in a dozen different languages, displays the same breaking news headline: "Collection in progress."
The entity has dropped the camouflage. It no longer needs to use the 1:13 a.m. emergency override. The infrastructure of global communication has been entirely and overtly hijacked. The machine is fully operational.
And then the secondary devices go off. Emergency alert sirens start blaring from phones everywhere. The narrator's phone buzzes violently in his pocket. The notification pops up, an automated government warning. It just says, "Do not watch the broadcast after midnight. Seek immediate shelter." But the tragic irony is that it's way too late. The warning is delivered via the exact same screen that delivers the plague.
It highlights the inescapable paradox of our hyper-connected age. The tools we rely on for salvation and emergency information are the very conduits of our destruction. When the ecosystem itself is toxic, an alert sent through that ecosystem only guarantees further exposure.
The entity in the room leans closer to the narrator, and for the first time, he sees its face clearly in the glow of the televisions. It doesn't have eyes. Where the eyes should be, there are just massive, empty black sockets. But the sockets aren't empty, they are moving like liquid. And floating inside that black liquid are tiny, microscopic television screens, flickering endlessly, showing thousands of people screaming silently.
The entity is physically composed of the very thing it consumes. It is a biological server rack.
That is exactly the analogy that came to my mind. A demonic, organic server rack. It isn't a predator eating flesh for calories, it is harvesting human attention. The liquid black eye sockets full of screaming TVs, it's storing the consciousness of the viewers like data on a hard drive to power whatever massive machine it serves.
And this brings us to the core philosophy of the global scale event. If we connect this to the bigger picture, why does this machine work? Why hasn't humanity simply turned off the screens? Well, the reporter on the television finally stands up from her desk, a physical action she has never taken before. The camera pans back. And we see that the dark studio behind her isn't just a small room. It stretches impossibly far into the darkness. There are endless, infinite rows of news desks.
It looks like an industrial factory floor designed for broadcasting.
Exactly. And the screens in the studio change. They stop showing the reporter, and they start showing live feeds of homes around the world. The narrator sees a family in Tokyo clustered around a glowing television. He sees a commuter in London staring at a phone on a dark train. He sees a teenager in Brazil watching a live stream in a pitch-black bedroom. And at every single feed, behind every single viewer, a silent, wet paper figure is standing in the darkness, waiting.
The scale of the harvest is unimaginable, and as the narrator watches this global collection, the reporter smiles warmly at the camera and delivers the most chilling, damning line of the entire narrative. She says, in this very gentle, almost pitying voice, they always invite us in themselves.
That line is the fulcrum upon which the entire cautionary tale rests. The broadcast does not force its way into human consciousness. It doesn't break down the physical door. It doesn't hold a gun to anyone's head. It relies entirely on human compulsion. It relies on our innate, morbid inability to look away from a train wreck. The viewer is the essential fuel. Without our active, willing participation in watching, the broadcast is impotent. It has no conduit into our reality.
It is the absolute modernization of the classic vampire myth. In traditional folklore, a vampire cannot cross the threshold of your home unless you verbally invite it in. The monster requires your consent to destroy you.
But the architecture of consent has fundamentally changed. We
Yeah.
don't stand at our front doors and say, "Come in," anymore.
No, we just click play. We just refuse to close the app, we bypass the age gate, we accept the cookies, we invite the vampires in through our retinas. Every single time we prioritize the glowing screen over our physical reality, we're giving the entity permission to cross the threshold.
We architect our own doom through microscopic, mundane choices. The decision to watch one more video at 2 a.m. isn't framed as a life or death choice. But in the aggregate of the attention economy, it is the surrender of autonomy. And the story illustrates the absolute, final consequence of that surrender with the narrator's ultimate transformation. The climax of the narrative is not a triumphant battle or a narrow escape. It is the final descent from a curious observer into a trapped cog in an infernal machine.
The atmosphere in the apartment changes instantly. All the hundreds of televisions shut off at the exact same time. The low hum stops. The screaming sirens from the phone stop. There is just absolute suffocating silence again. And then one single small television sitting on the kitchen counter clicks back on.
The isolation returns, but this time the context is entirely different.
The small screen fills with loud, violent static. And slowly, an image resolves through the white noise. It's a face. But it's the narrator's face. He is looking at himself again. But he looks drastically different. His skin is waxy and pale. He looks years older. And his eyes are completely, solidly black, just like the liquid sockets of the entity. The face on the screen looks out at the narrator, smiles softly, and whispers, "Your shift starts soon."
The inevitability of his fate is confirmed by his own corrupted image. He isn't just going to die. He is going to be put to work.
The physical world shatters, the apartment lights violently burst, raining glass down, and suddenly the walls of the apartment just dissolve. They wipe away like static on a screen. The physical atmosphere violently shifts. He is no longer standing in a cozy domestic living room. The air drops in temperature. The smell of ozone and sterile electronics fills his lungs. He is standing physically inside the dark studio.
He has been fully digitized. The upload is complete. He has been entirely absorbed into the architecture of the broadcast.
And the scope of this place is terrifying. It is a massive, endless space. Rows and rows of identical news desks stretch out through the darkness as far as the eye can see. Thousands of studio lights glow faintly overhead. And sitting at every single desk, bathed in the pale light, are people. They are sitting perfectly straight, reading games calmly into thousands of camera lenses. But as the narrator walks past them, he realizes they aren't human anymore.
They are the victims of previous collections.
Yes. Some of them have deeply distorted faces. Some are missing mouths entirely, yet their voices still echo perfectly through the studio. Some of them look as though their bodies have melted and fused into the plastic of their chairs. They are part of the furniture.
This sequence maps the complete psychological and physical transformation of the consumer into the product. It is crucial to note that this isn't hell in the traditional Dante's Inferno sense. There are no lakes of fire, no pitchforks, no physical torture. It is an eternal corporate purgatory. It's an endless, sterile office space where the punishment is infinite, meaningless labor. It is the ultimate alienation of the worker applied to the digital age.
And the detail that genuinely crushed me, the part that made my stomach turn, was looking at their expressions. Because while they are reading these horrific lists of names, predicting the deaths of innocent people back in the real world, some of these reporters are actively crying. Tears are streaming down their faces. Some of them are desperately whispering for help between the names. But their mouths keep moving. They cannot stop reading. Their bodies are moving like meat puppets against their own will.
That is the true horror of the narrative, the absolute loss of autonomy. The ultimate consequence of severe addiction to destructive media is that the consumer eventually becomes the content. You lose your agency. The fact that they are crying, the fact that they are begging for help, proves that their human empathy, their soul, essentially survives the collection process. But it is entirely, utterly powerless against the machinery of the broadcast. They are trapped in a state of hyper-awareness of their own subjugation. They know they are causing harm, and they cannot stop themselves.
It is the nightmare of being a passenger in your own body. The original smiling reporter, the one who started this whole thing, walks up to the narrator. She looks completely serene. She gently hands him a stack of papers. It's a death report for tomorrow, and there are thousands of names printed on it. She leans in and whispers, "You watched long enough now, you belong to the channel."
The transaction is complete. He traded his life, his attention, his physical existence for an endless stream of content. And the currency he's to pay for it was his own autonomy. Now, he must generate the content for the next viewer.
The final image of the story just leaves you staring at the ceiling. The narrator sits down at his assigned desk. He looks into the dark lens of the camera. And in his mind, he can feel the millions of viewers out there in the real world, sitting on their couches, bathed in blue light, waiting silently in the dark, waiting for the next broadcast, waiting for the thrill of the tragedy. And as the red recording light clicks on, the narrator realizes one final, horrific truth. He realizes that somewhere far behind the cameras, deep in the endless darkness of the studio, something enormous moved inside the static, breathing softly, hungry. The reporter whispers one final thing to him before he starts reading. She says, "The news never stops. Every broadcast needs new voices."
The machine is perfect self-perpetuating. The victims become the vectors for the next wave of victims. It is a closed loop of consumption and generation.
Okay, let's take a deep breath, because that is an incredibly heavy, dense journey we just took. So, what does this all mean? To briefly summarize the massive arc we just explored, we tracked the narrator's terrifying descent from the initial hook of a 1:13 a.m. broadcast, which capitalized on the biological vulnerabilities of a late-night auditory vacuum. We watched as basic, morbid curiosity mutated into a viral spread, with the media utilizing algorithmic camouflage to dynamically alter its appearance and maximize engagement. We analyzed the terrifying moment the fourth wall collapsed, shifting the screen from a protective barrier into a two-way window, and examined the deep cosmic horror of the threat our technology cannot even focus on.
We also dissected the profound philosophical implications of the collection process. We explored the mind-body disconnect, the digital dissociation where the physical body perishes unnoticed while the consciousness is entirely absorbed by the flow state of the screen.
Which eventually escalated into a global epidemic, proving that our collective attention is the literal fuel for this supernatural machine. We consent to the invasion every time we refuse to look away. And finally, we ended up in that corporate purgatory, forced into eternal servitude to feed a monster made of static. Our core thesis today, the reason we dug so deeply into this, is that this story is a brilliant, unyielding metaphor for media addiction. It brutally illustrates how our insatiable desire to consume tragedy, to doom scroll, to stare safely into the abyss of our screens, ultimately allows the abyss to reach out and consume our humanity.
It forces us to examine the ecosystem we are actively participating in and perpetuating with every click. Which leaves us with one final, vital thing to consider. We have talked extensively today about how the viewers invite the broadcast in by choosing to watch. We've seen how the victims are digested and recycled into the next generation of puppet reporters. But I want you to think about that enormous, unseen entity mentioned in the very last sentence. The thing breathing softly, hungry, deep inside the static. If the reporters sitting at the desks are just the puppets, and we, the viewers sitting on our couches, are just the fuel, what exactly is the media ecosystem we've built actually feeding? What massive unseen architecture is the ultimate beneficiary of all our extracted attention, our anxiety, and our lost hours? The next time you find yourself endlessly scrolling past midnight, your face washed in that pale blue light, ask yourself, are you simply consuming the content, or is something in the static quietly consuming you?